I'm Joseph Capizzi, the Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation today on creating resilient communities, the necessity of theology for social science, which I just learned a few minutes ago was not actually Margarita's title. That's all right. It's okay. She's going to speak on this anyway. Our presenter is Margarita Mooney. She's an IHE fellow here with us. She's also the Associate Professor of Congregational Studies at Princeton Seminary. She earned her MA and her PhD in Sociology from Princeton University and her BA in Psychology at Yale University. She served as an Associate Research Scientist in the Department of Sociology at Yale and previously taught at Princeton University and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's currently the co-principal director with Philip Gorski of the Human Flourishing and Critical Realism in the Social Sciences Project, funded by a $2.5 million grant from the Templeton Foundation. As a sociologist of religion, Dr. Mooney explores how religious beliefs in congregations facilitate immigration integration and how religious beliefs and practices contribute to congregants' health and well-being. She's the co-author or author of some 20 articles. Her current research for a forthcoming book, Living a Broken Life Beautifully, combines quantitative and qualitative research data and exploring the relationship between religion, moral meaning, and resilience. It's our pleasure to welcome her. We're really pleased to have her spend time with us. She's been here for more than a few days, having been at the Land O'Lakes conference on Friday. So we're really grateful that you were able to stay over until today. Again, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mooney.
Thank you. Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Before I got started, I just wanted to mention that, in comes my Aunt Mary. It's great to see so many familiar faces from North Carolina, from the different places where I've been. But I thought I would just mention that my parents actually met here at the Catholic University of America. My mother had moved to the United States from Cuba, and after spending a few years, I think, working and supporting her younger siblings, she enrolled here and met my father, who was a graduate student, though younger than her. She went to chess club to make new friends, and she was the only woman there, lo and behold. And he invited her to a game of chess, and she beat him. She was very proud of that, and he would always reply that she never beat him ever again in their life together. And it's funny, one of my favorite, if not my favorite family picture, was actually taken on the steps of the shrine. We're a very large family. My mom's Cuban family is actually 8 girls and 6 boys, and in that picture, I'm just a baby wearing a little dress. I'm 1 year old, but I look at that picture, and it's really odd because all of those 8 women look just like me. And lo and behold, my aunt is wearing the exact same color as me. And people typically think she's my sister, but she's actually my aunt. Hi, Mary. All right. Well, so I wanted to do a few things in my talk today. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background, about what it was about my background that led me into questions about resilience and faith. And I'll tell you a little bit about 2 different research projects that I've been in that have both led me to explore the sort of philosophical and theological presuppositions as well as implications of social science research. So I want the talk to be both about my empirical work, but also about what does it mean to do social science that takes theology and philosophy seriously? What does this relationship look like between the social sciences and theology and philosophy? And I'm going to try to cover all that ground in 20 to 30 minutes so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I thought I'd just briefly to tell you how I got to where I am. That picture in the top left-hand corner is me as a baby. That's my mother playing guitar, one of her favorite things. And when I was growing up in Frederick, Maryland in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of people moving there from Central America because of the wars. And I was the only girl in my family, so I followed my mother everywhere, and I heard these really crazy stories of people walking here from El Salvador, leaving their families behind in Guatemala. Stuff as a child that I found very difficult to understand. And I was really moved both by these people's life stories and how much they had overcome, as well as their ability to have a lot of joy and faith in God, despite really often difficult circumstances. So when I went to Yale as an undergraduate, I studied psychology because I wanted to understand deeper the human problems I had seen as a child growing up. After that, I spent 3 years actually living in Central America. I worked for former president of Costa Rica, Oscar Arias, who had won a Nobel Peace Prize, and I actually did field work with ex-combatants of the civil wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. So visiting those communities that had been ravaged by war, talking to people who had fought on both sides and sometimes lost their limbs, lost family members, showed me that the kinds of human problems I was interested in were so much bigger than individuals or communities, and really had a lot to do with global economic affairs, political battles, etc. So I looked around for what to study in graduate school and settled on sociology, because I thought sociology seemed to have a really diverse toolkit for understanding social problems, everything from historical work to data to ethnography, interviews. But when I got to Princeton, I struggled with a lot of aspects of social theory, and now I'll sort of tell you how I've worked through that by turning back to my interest in Catholic social teaching and how that led me to think more about the implications of philosophy and sociology for how we do social science. So my first book, that's the cover of my first book, Faith Makes Us Live, Surviving and Thriving in the Haitian Diaspora. That was the result of my dissertation project, in which I spent about 2 years doing fieldwork in Haiti. I actually learned French and Haitian Creole. Most of my fieldwork was in Haitian Creole. I sang a lot. I had grown up singing, and great way to learn a language. I joined the choir, and Haitians love to sing. It's great fun. And I did 144 interviews, both in Haiti as well as in Miami, Montreal, and Paris. And what I was actually trying to understand was how these 3 Haitian Catholic missions in Montreal, Miami, and Paris facilitated the assimilation of Haitian immigrants. I also looked at census and immigration data to get a sense of the upward mobility in economics or education in the Haitian populations. And to make a long story short, I essentially argue that in the United States, the cooperative model between the Haitian church communities and the government in terms of facilitating integration was a more successful model of immigrant assimilation than in France or in Quebec, where the expectation was that immigrants would give up their particular religious or ethnic identities and assimilate by becoming similar to the French and sort of individuals relating to the state without these mediating institutions. But when we looked at the indicators of assimilation, Haitians really weren't doing very well in those 2 cities. And part of what I was trying to do was to get my colleagues in sociology who, thought that religion was really most effective at helping people flee from their problems and actually show the importance of religious faith and religious communities to the upward mobility of Haitian immigrants. But when the book was done and I was out giving talks, I'll never forget this one conversation I had with a theologian in Quebec. And she actually found people's narratives of faith that I presented in my book to be really interesting in and of themselves, right? How they found God, how I talked about one woman who had forgiven a man who had raped her as an act of intimidation in the political campaign. I talked about people who found hope in these desperate circumstances, and she thought those stories were interesting in and of themselves, and pointed out to me that whenever I told a narrative of someone's faith experience, I turned it into kind of an instrumental variable that did something for them in the world. And I thought, well, isn't this what we're supposed to do? Yeah. So what I have here on the left is kind of what I came to see as the vocabulary, the implicit vocabulary of so much social science research, right? That we're rational actors seeking to instrumentally achieve goals. And the goal of social science is to kind of understand empirical regularities that help people gain control and sort of predict and master their social environment. And all of this, all of these words here I have on the right, surrender, hope, joy, I put them in kind of squishy, curvy letters, right? They're soft, those things aren't kind of hard variables. They're experiences, they're, subjective, they're feelings maybe, but they're not really relevant as objects for the study of social science. They're only relevant to the extent that they become kind of one of the instrumental variables that promotes a particular type of outcome. So I didn't really know what to do with all these experiences, so I did what I think I had learned to do in sociology, which was simply write people's narratives as faithfully as I could, which of course, on the other side, I was sometimes critiqued for not realizing that people were just being told to feel like they should forgive somebody who raped them, and they were just following somebody else's idea of who God is, and people couldn't really be having these experiences. They were just conditioned to talk that way because, of course, as Black, poor immigrants, what else are they going to say about themselves? I thought that was a little paternalistic, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if you like. But I thought you couldn't just simply discard first-person accounts because of a different philosophical perspective. So after the book came out, I sort of began to rethink my own approach to the social sciences, and I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I just put up some of the books that I read and really grappled with. First of all, After Virtue. One positive development in sociology is that a lot of sociologists I know have finally read After Virtue. It came out in 1981. I think I read it 25 years after it came out, but at least now people have started to say that there might be something about the social science methodology that needs to be rethought. There's also a movement that I became part of in sociology to think about critical realism and the philosophy of social science. Christian Smith had published Moral Believing Animals. When I was in graduate school, he went on to expand that, bringing in critical realism and thinking about the nature of the human person and what kinds of explanations we can give in social science. Margaret Archer, you can't really see her name, it's the bottom book there. She's a British sociologist, I believe she is, or was the president of the Vatican Council on Social Sciences, wrote a lot of books critiquing the philosophy of the social science for reducing the human person into an instrumental or strategic rational actor. So after all of this kind of philosophical thinking, I said, okay, well, so first of all, it empowered me, I was really moved when McIntyre said something I had always thought, right? That philosophy, and I would actually say some of theology presupposes a sociology, right? So on the one hand, I liked this quote because sometimes when I talk with people doing philosophy and theology that want to apply it to the world, they're implicitly talking about the world. And to the extent I thought theology was making statements about God, if you're going to use theology making statements about the world, implicitly you're getting your ideas about the world from somewhere. And I found it interesting that people in philosophy or theology have lots of ideas about the world that they couldn't tell me quite where they got them from. And what we do in sociology is train people really well and thoroughly to study the world, and don't necessarily train them to think about what they're learning and its implications for philosophy or theology. And so we end up with what Alan Wolf, who's a sociologist, has said, that a lot of social scientists run around doing philosophy and theology and don't acknowledge it, because our default starting point is that we're doing value-free social science, and that philosophical or theological presuppositions don't enter into the science. And I started to question this position, and I thought, okay, well, what's a good way to kind of, again, go back to my love of fieldwork and interviews, and to use the sociological toolkit in a way that's not reducing the human person. So I wrote and got a grant to study young adults in the US who had suffered trauma. In part, the way I went about that project was responding to some of the critiques of my earlier book. Well, you're saying religion is important for people who are already in communities, but what about all the people who don't belong to any kind of religious community, or what about people who aren't in any kind of community at all? Well, it's really hard to study people who don't belong to anything, but I found a way. I persuaded, just to back up, this is kind of the problem I see in sociology. You probably can barely see that, we tend to focus on the research questions and data, right? That's our strength. Questions, data, that's all we talk about. But lurking in the background is often these normative and practical implications where we either deny that they're there, or we can't quite tell you how we got there and don't know how to discuss them. So I just realized that good social science should be able to talk about the normative and the practical. And I think that's what we can learn from theology and philosophy, how to talk about those things. So I set out to study this group. There's a lot of information on this graph, but basically what this is showing is that indeed a lot of people in the United States no longer report belonging to any kind of religion, right? So we haven't seen a massive amount of leaving from the biggest increase has been that more and more people just say that they're a none. They don't belong to anything. It's almost 17 or 18% of the population. And it's not so much that weekly church attendance, that's what this graph is showing, it's not so much that weekly church attendance is tanking, but what's really going up is the numbers of people who don't even go occasionally, right? So it used to be that people who didn't go every week still went a couple times a year, but now it's almost 20% of the population never sets foot inside of a church, right? That's the biggest change that we've seen. So how do you find these people? Well, I went to the National Study of Youth and Religion, and there's a lot of information on this slide. I'm going to stay on this slide for a couple minutes. I went to the National Study of Youth and Religion, spoke with Chris Smith, and told him I wanted to interview young adults who had experienced some kind of trauma and wanted to use his survey data to try to identify people who had high levels of trauma, some of whom seemed to be very resilient based on indicators we could get from the survey, some who did not seem to be very resilient. So I spent a lot of time analyzing all these questions on the data, broke the data down in a whole bunch of ways, and ended up picking 26 cases that were outliers, people who had high levels of trauma and seemed to be really flourishing in terms of their economic mobility, self-reported psychological health, and those who seemed to be languishing, who reported some sort of depression or weren't finishing school, etc. And I got their contact information, contacted 26 people, all of whom actually agreed to be interviewed, and traveled to 26 communities in 10 different states, 2 different times. So it's actually just going to 26 communities all across the US was an education. The idea there was to get people's in-depth narratives, but really vary the community context, right? To see what kinds of resources people had in their community, what kinds of belonging they had, rather than what we often do, which is interview a bunch of people from one community, or as I had done in my book, 3 communities. Most people don't even do 3. Well, now I did 26. And I asked a lot of questions. I would simply usually start off by asking people where they had grown up and if they had moved, and if you want to get people talking, ask them about their relationship with their parents. That's usually pretty interesting stories there. And then usually within the first few minutes of the interview, I got a sense of what the traumatic life event had been with these people. Just to give one example, one woman kept saying that she had a bad relationship with her mother, and I just said, well, was there some point in your life when this soured? She said, well, yeah. When I was 13, something happened and we just stopped talking. And I was like, well, what happened? She said, well, it's just, she always blamed herself for it. And I said, she blamed herself for it. What did she? And then I don't know where I got this question from, but I just said, did somebody hurt you? And she kind of froze. And I said, well, you don't have to answer all my questions, that whole, human subjects thing. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. And she goes, no, it's okay. And then she told me she had been sexually abused for 4 years by her mother's husband, by her stepfather. And that when this came out, he was sent to jail, they got divorced. She actually started to cope with her pain. She started cutting herself with razor blades, and so she described this kind of giving herself physical pain to drown her emotional pain. It was pretty interesting. By the time I had met her, she had converted to Pentecostal Christianity and had this tremendous healing experience and was doing ministry with other young women. She was actually one of only 5 of the 26 people I talked to who had belonged to her church. Her story and other stories, that got me, again, rethinking my project. There was another woman who, when I was trying to figure out what she told me when we first met, that she had 3 heart surgeries by the time she was 16 years old. She had a very severe heart condition, and so she always thought she was going to die, basically. But yet she told me she didn't believe in God, and on the survey she clicked that she never prays, doesn't believe in God, might believe in some sort of cosmic force, doesn't go to church. She was just nothing. But she had so much suffering, and I finally said to her, well, did you ever pray to God in your worst moments? And she said, well, not exactly, but there was this one time. And again, razor blades, she says, I threw myself down on the ground. I was 16, I was done. I was ready for it all to be done, and I just wanted it all to be over. And this time I was really going to take my own life. When suddenly something came, and this force overcame me, said, don't do it. And I dropped the razor blades. And I said, well, what do you think this force was? And she said, well, I don't know. I studied a little bit of Buddhism, I studied a little bit of Christianity. I don't know what it was. And I said, well, If you don't know what it was, why do you think it was something supernatural? And her answer was really interesting. She said, no. When you're that depressed and all you can think is that you want it to be over, and suddenly everything stops and you change, no, that wasn't me. So this story got me because she had this powerful supernatural experience, but didn't believe in God still, and didn't join a church. But yet, she was persuaded that she's not alone in the universe. And there was something really profound about her believing that she's not alone. And then she did admit at the end of the interview, without me asking, we got to the end of the interview, and she said, the only other time I pray is when I'm thinking about my brother. She has a brother who's institutionalized for schizophrenia. And so she prays sometimes to this God that she's not sure even exists to please help her brother. So I thought, what do I make of these cases? On the one hand, this Pentecostal woman has a high degree of flourishing in some ways because she has a really meaningful narrative, but on every indicator, she never finished high school, her only income was as a dog sitter. On all the typical indicators of success, she's at the bottom. And then I have this other woman who doesn't believe in God, never goes to church, makes a six-figure income, actually, finished college, and is doing very well, but has all of these experiences that she can't explain, right? So it really got me to see that, once again, I was running into this problem in sociology, that we always end up wanting to define things in terms of average outcomes and measurable indicators. And I wasn't sure that in presenting these two women, which one of them is more resilient? It seemed that I was being pushed by the methods of social science to compare these really different cases, both of which I thought had different but important lessons to be taught. So I kind of want to leave lots of time for the Q&A, but what I ended up doing, I published a couple of shorter articles that would summarize all the interviews and compare different people and define concepts, the typical things that we do. But I decided to write a book more geared towards a popular audience, because based on these interviews that I did, I heard all kinds of stuff. I think 11 out of the 26 had been diagnosed with some kind of mental illness, and of those 11, almost all of them, by the time I met them, had stopped taking medication. About half of those 11 were self-medicating with pretty serious drugs and alcohol, but they thought this was preferable to medication. And the other half had developed some kind of intensive spiritual practice as a way of dealing with their mental illness. So I also interviewed people who were struggling with addiction, alcohol. I interviewed at least a couple of people who had been in treatment programs for heroin or other hard drugs. And those people, in fact, two of them had relapsed on drugs by the second time that I went back. And so I really just started to think, is the only thing I can say about someone who's struggling with addiction that, well, they're not very resilient. But I thought there was something to what was in their stories. So in the book, I ended up calling it, for now at least, Living a Broken Life Beautifully, because I thought that I wanted to try to capture for a popular audience the importance of understanding people's narratives, where you can actually hear their inner lives and hear them thinking through their own problems. So for a sociologist, it's actually a rather bold claim to even say that I have access to people's inner lives. But I think part of the problem with sociology is that we deny that people can know anything about their inner life or can speak about it. And people have said this to me, people can't tell you what they really think. And I was like, well, do you really think what you just said? Or are you just saying? What do you mean by that? And we have very much adopted a kind of motivation that's really a deterministic view of motivation. It's really, again, this rational, strategic. And, I started to say, well, I don't know. I think people are intrinsically motivated to love their parents who hurt them, or, forgive people who hurt them, even if they don't necessarily get a benefit from that. It just sounds strange to say that it's beneficial to this young Pentecostal woman to forgive her stepfather because somehow it makes her more something or the other. She's forgiving this man because she feels that it's her obligation to forgive him because God forgave her. That's what she says. So we're constantly changing the meaning of what people say about their experiences to fit the terms that we can deal with. So I'm trying to And I'm also trying to say that although I think the study of resilience is really important, I kept running into this wall with social science that we want to again turn all of our knowledge into a tool to make people resilient, and we've got pretty much nothing to say to those who are not resilient, right? What do we say to the young woman whose baby drowned in her backyard, who's asking, is there a finish line to my pain, and why would God abandon me and let my child die? What do we say? Well, you're going to have post-traumatic growth, and you're going to be stronger, and it's a good thing your baby died. But you don't say that to somebody. You don't necessarily tell her to go sign up for a post-traumatic growth class or something. But yet she felt very alone in her suffering, like she didn't have anyone to talk to about it. So I'm using these narratives to both talk about the complex causality of the issues I found around mental illness and addiction, and simply say that we're not going to get better solutions by simply focusing on one aspect of the picture. And also to just think about the kind of moral and practical wisdom that we need to even understand these stories, and think about what it would mean to accompany people who have had tremendous suffering, some of whom may end up being resilient and achieving outcomes that we think are worthwhile, and some of whom may spend a long period of their life when they don't seem to be productive or useful. And this problem really hit home with me with the two people I interviewed who had extensive drug problems and criminal records. I mean, they're not going to turn around likely and have very productive lives in any sense. But yet, as ethicists like Stanley Hauerwas and others have said, we have an obligation to care for people, even to care for people whose suffering is partially due to their own choices. And what does that mean as a society to actually create communities that are caring for people who are suffering either because of conditions out of their control, or even for things that they may have in some ways chosen to do. And so when I speak about this and continue to write, I've just gone down reading more philosophy and theology and trying to bring back into the social science, I think, the wisdom that can come from the philosophical and theological traditions that talk about what is the human good, and what is the human good even in the face of often really great suffering. And also I put myself into the narrative and how I reacted in some of the situations. And when I give talks in the research and write about it, I'm trying to break down the other typical approach we do when we're doing interviews, which is very much subject and object, right? And I sort of take this for granted because this is how we're trained. We're trained to talk about the people we interviewed from this kind of analytic and almost therapeutic distance, as if hearing these stories wasn't also really impactful on me, and it got me to really rethink some of my own experiences and some of my own presuppositions. And so, and it's also gotten me to reflect on questions that I don't think I have a really good answer to. Even in one of my interview transcripts, I'm reading this, and I said to the Pentecostal woman, I said, well, if God loves everybody, how come everybody isn't healed? And several years later, reading that question, I thought, gosh, there's a reason that I asked that question, right? Because she's had this powerful experience of healing. But yet, I was asking, how do you respond? Because I care about how she thinks about that question. How do you respond to someone when they're not healed, even when you desperately want it? That's a deeply personal question to me that this project really made me struggle with. So moving forward, what does all of this say? Well, I think that when I'm done with this book, or what I've been thinking about would be kind of, if I were to design a new research project, and one I've been thinking about, talking with some people from the Lilly Endowment about what would be an approach to research that would look at resilience and perhaps look at intentional communities. One thing I discovered in this research was, again, how weak people's ties are to any kind of community. And I'm really struck by this term and this movement to create intentional communities. I think we can no longer presuppose that people have ties to community or church. And what are those people doing? And what kinds of intentional communities? I think of examples like L'Arche is one that's very well known. What kinds of intentional communities are there that actually have a focus on the vulnerable or on those who are suffering? And as I've moved now into teaching graduate students who are pursuing a degree in divinity while also teaching undergraduates doing sociology, it's really fun to sort of employ my toolkit with these different types of students. And I find that what I think the sociological approach can bring, regardless of what degree people are pursuing, is this real attention to context and to process and to ecology. And I do think that sociology has a great toolkit for how to do observational research, for how to study specific communities, collect narratives, and bring that into dialogue with the data that we have, not relying just on quantitative data, but actually bringing it into dialogue. So I think with this question of, the necessity of theology for social science, I would certainly love it if my social science colleagues would read and consider wisdom coming from theology. But I also think that people studying theology and philosophy can learn a lot from really well done ethnographic studies, interview studies, data, that there's something about immersing yourself in the world and writing about the world, regardless of what philosophical or theological presuppositions, when a really well done sociological study is a wealth of information that can lead to all kinds of important reflection on theory and philosophy and theology. So, I say to students sometimes who talk in terms of, justice or, inclusivity or something like that, well, when you put that down into a particular context, you have to define that concept for that place and that community. And what that actually looks like in practice might then influence the way that you even think about that as a concept. So what does that look like with teaching people who are primarily interested in theology to think about what their concepts about the world are and how they might be even revised or rethought by encountering those concepts and how they're employed in the world. So I would love to, in the Q&A, talk about these larger issues of theology, philosophy, and social science, talk about the specific research questions on resilience, or just hear from you. What are some pressing questions today about the world that would be fruitful for people who are trained in social science, as well as those trained in theology or philosophy, to pursue together? What are the strengths and limitations of each of our approaches? And what happens when we come together and try to work on projects together? Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. You've given us such a broad presentation from different angles, right, that really allows us, I think, to ask very different kinds of questions. We have good time. We've got 20, 25 minutes or so to ask questions, so if you have some, Margarita will moderate this on her own. Okay?
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you. In regards to those studies you mentioned about the rise of the religious nuns, like the lack of church attendance and the lack of a population to describe themselves as either non-religious or non-religious affiliated, do you think beyond certain issues such as mental health or family situations, but also with the rise of a more educated population and the rapid rise of science and technology and scientific and technological discoveries and capabilities, whether it's, we launched another telescope into the universe and we discovered A, B, or C, or genetic engineering as one big factor, do you think that could also contribute to the rise of religious nuns, especially in more developed countries such as the US and around the world?
I teach about this in my undergraduate classes, and I think people argued in the secularization theory, most notably, that science and technology would displace religion. And there's actually that has happened for a small segment of the highly educated white males for the most part, but most of the rise in the religious nuns tends to come from lack of religious socialization in the household and kind of just a slow sliding away, perhaps intermarriage, so people are now more likely to marry someone from a different faith. So the book and the data I point people to are mostly Mark Jave's book, Trends in American Religion, and I'm pretty persuaded that the rise of the nuns is not due to any kind of cataclysmic change in worldview, but to a variety of different small things ticking away, one of which could be science, but that would hold for a certain percentage of the population. But for the people that I interviewed, it was more often the case, and this is what Mark Jave says, they had one Methodist parent and one Catholic parent, so they sometimes went here, sometimes went there, never developed a commitment or a practice, and then when those people grow to be adults, they simply stop attending. So I think it's really more demographic and cultural change and a broad embrace of science. And what I actually think we don't know a lot about, there was a presumption that people in the none category don't pray and don't believe in the supernatural, and that's not at all what I found. What they have is a mixture of kind of, well, I do Wicca and I read the Bible, or, people ask people. You have to find creative ways to ask people if they've ever had some kind of experience with the supernatural. Almost all the time they say yes, and they have something. So they're not naturalists in the philosophical sense or materialists. They definitely all say that they believe in some sort of non-empirical reality. But it's not grounded in any kind of specific philosophical or theological tradition. And I actually think that presents a challenge for people doing evangelization or doing ministry. Because people aren't coming from a rationalist philosophical perspective, they're coming from a very diffuse and often hard to define understanding of what is that non-empirical reality that people sense.
Hi, this is great. I'm a moral theologian, but I studied McIntyre in graduate school, but now I've discovered Margaret Archer, and so maybe McIntyre will be displaced as the answer to all questions. But I do want to ask you about critical realism. There's this material in Archer especially about reflexivity, and about these different modes of reflexivity, and have you used that in your research? And if you haven't, do you have an alternative way of thinking about what's going on when agents actually try to work through cultural ideas?
Yeah. So I think Margaret Archer's work on reflexivity is really important, and I don't draw on it so explicitly.
Could you tell us what it is? In like 20 words.
Yeah, have fun. You're the sociologist.
She uses it mostly building on Charles Sanders Peirce and the idea of the internal conversation and how people imagine themselves in relationship to either their immediate circumstances and what it means to actually develop a sort of moral position in the world. And she distinguishes different modes of reflexivity. She actually started off studying education in class, and so part of her argument is that there's a group of people called meta-reflexives who think about their place in relationship to the entire world politics, whereas other people are deeply reflexive about how they're going to get their next job, right? So she's arguing that everybody is reflexive, but what varies is what are people reflexive about, right? I don't draw on it that much, but I think that because part of what I'm trying to do is push more directly on how people are reflexive about the supernatural, which she doesn't directly address. I mean, she leaves it open. So I'm actually really interested in these experiences that people have about the supernatural, what their reflexivity is about ultimate concern. So she definitely talks about that, but how do people's reflections on whatever this ultimate reality is then influence their responses and their agency in the world? But that presumes that we can know something about this supernatural. So I find that that's the hard part for sociologists. We're happy to talk about reflexivity with regards to global politics or your local neighborhood trash policy, but reflexivity about ultimate concerns and the supernatural presumes an a priori commitment that those powers of the supernatural exist and can work in this world. And most of my sociology colleagues would find that very troubling, which I think ends up, again, leading to this instrumentalization problem, that we can only talk about the supernatural when it has an effect that we deem desirable in this world. And all the rest of it is, I don't know, inexplicable, delusional, irrelevant.
Is it not just a form of meta-reflexivity?
I think, and this is very critical realist of me, I think you have to define the object about which people are reflecting. And I think reflecting about for example, terrorism is a different thing to reflect about than the nature of the supernatural. So is it an example of it? Perhaps, but it's a very different object. And when you talk to people, they acknowledge this. They don't think their government is has the same nature and essence as God. I mean, so I'm not sure that we analyze how people relate to God, because God's eternal, because he's transcendent, because he's boundless, because he's bigger. People experience these things. And that's not the language they use to talk about their government, or their parents even. So then to say that it's just another, well, I think that's what I like, hopefully, if I understand what philosophy is good at, it's defining what is the object, right? And we just want to forget about what the object is and look at what its effect is on something, but we don't want to talk about the nature of the object, which I think is a little problematic, because people care.
Sure.
Yes?
Thank you. I find this really exciting, and still is part of this group sponsored by Templeton on virtue and happiness. And we had philosophers, theologians, and psychologists. And it wasn't that hard to get the philosophers and theologians to talk to each other, but to get the bridge, the gap was between those two and the psychologists. Obviously, psychology isn't sociology, but you're thinking really hard about this. And I'm very glad. Okay, could you back up to the slide with the squishy stuff next to the stuff that was all the firm stuff, whatever? Yeah, I just want to confirm something. So, okay, yeah, good. So on the left-hand side here, fourth from the bottom, you have rationality. And then all these other things here are apparently part of the non-rationality zone. Now that makes me think of Pope Benedict's Regensburg lecture, where one of the things that he critiques is the idea that reason is just all about either the hard sciences or economic rationality, getting what you want. Now, on one hand, I mean, I don't want to just raise a pedantic point about how to use the word reason, but in another way, I'm wondering whether part of making progress here is breaking through that idea that all this stuff over here is the irrational stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just want you to, it seems to me that that's related to some of the other points you were making. For example, there's a temptation to think that if people are like, they finished college, they're pulling down six figures, they're successful, and if they're kind of not, then they're not successful. But like, I think those are related because of that notion of rationality. So I just wanted to throw that out there as something. I want to hear more from you about this.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that. I mean, this slide here is representing what I think sociologists would mean.
Yeah, no, I see that.
And I think that kind of the difficulty with the interdisciplinary dialogue is that I don't think a lot of psychologists are reading Benedict on rationality.
Right.
I think it's extremely fruitful when they do, and then they think about what does that mean. So you know I read those things, and I think he's really on to something. But when I try to get people to rethink this, again, I draw on what psychologists and sociologists should care about, which is, well, it's empirical, it's real people, the way people actually talk about themselves. And that's what I always try to draw back on, because to the extent, these are different ways to critique a philosophy, right? From outside of it or from within it.
Yeah.
And because I'm really coming from within,
Yeah.
I simply say, but this is not how people describe themselves. So how do you reconcile that? And I try to get people to think, well, and I think actually Margaret Archer does some really great things about this, right? That we're rational about our emotions, and we're often really passionate about what we're very rational about. She points out, yes, very much so. And you start making those points, and you sort of start like, chipping away. And then I think I, of course, then would say, look, let's think about, Aristotle. Yeah. People are rational also because they're pondering kind of an ultimate end. Now, I have found with sociology, you start talking about Benedict or you start talking about Aristotle, and you run into this problem that they also believe in human nature, because the ends that we're rational about come from our nature. And this is a problematic assumption for a lot of mainstream social science, that there is such a thing as human nature. So at the very least, I tell them that, and then also just get them to see that our concept of rationality probably comes more from Kant, you know? And then it's a pretty modern way of thinking about it. And, you know, by the way, people in Haiti don't think that way, so if you're just going to label them as irrational, you're kind of maybe being a colonizer.
Yeah.
And maybe a little patriarchal, because, you know what's rational, and they're just, I don't know, irrational? I mean, it sounds like, cardinal sin of anthropology or psychology or sociology. So, so you can get the conversation going. So that's what I think. And what I try more to do is to get people to acknowledge that we can say something meaningful about these experiences. And that whether or not these experiences of forgiveness can be quantified and measured in a precise enough way to link its impact to later psychological health is, maybe that's important.
And correlated with family income or whatever, right?
Of course there's a place for that.
Yeah.
But it's not to deny that these experiences are in and of themselves intrinsic goods that people seek, right? That it's a concept of the human person, that we're made for love and we're made for hope, and that people want to have mercy, regardless of whether or not sometimes those things might actually be negative for some measure or some outcome, And to say that we can't only put all these in the plus column, because sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But whether or not we judge it as morally right or good depends on this larger narrative. It depends on the ultimate end, and it depends on the context.
Yeah. Thank you.
Joe?
Sure.
Hi, turning just a slightly different direction, it seems like everywhere I turn I see resilience nowadays. There was even I think this past Saturday, the Wall Street Journal had a little book review on a book on resilience. Since you've studied some philosophy and theology, how, if at all, does resilience relate to fortitude? Or do you think of it as relating to fortitude? I'm trying to get the definition of it. And then secondly, how do you study resilience? Because like resilience to me always connotes a certain bouncing back from something, right? And I was thinking of concussion testing, right? So kids go in, they get a concussion test. The concussion test establishes a baseline. They get a concussion. You see where it is, and then you have a sense of, okay, now they've bounced back to where the baseline was. It seems like resilience often sort of depends upon a certain notion. Somebody's suffered a catastrophe. But if you've not known them beforehand, right, to do the baseline test, how do you know to what they've bounced back? Or are you implying or imposing something on them? So I guess both the questions are trying to get at, what is resilience? How do you guys study that phenomenon? It seems challenging at the minute.
Yeah, hey, I like challenging projects. So there were several questions
The fortitude.
in what you said. The kind of probably the most common definition of resilience is the common sense definition that you yourself said, overcoming adversity. But I mean, that begs the question of what kind of adversity and what does it mean to overcome? And that, I think, depends on the specific context and what it is we're talking about. So I think one of the troubles is that we're good at coming up with these broad conceptual definitions, but recovering from a concussion is very different than recovering from sexual abuse, is very different than recovering from physical illness, where nobody's at fault for your illness, whereas in sexual abuse, somebody is at fault, right? So to assume that there's one kind of underlying process called resilience that is going to make you, that is a character trait that's going to make you resilient to concussions and sexual abuse and heart disease, I don't know. But sometimes things like resilience, but honestly I would say the same thing for fortitude. What is fortitude when a child dies is very different than what is fortitude when you get a negative review at work, right? So is there an inner characteristic called fortitude that we know exists and we know we can grow in? Yes. what does that look like, and in particular, what kind of causal impact does it have? That then begs a specific project and design, right? So I don't think simply because fortitude or resilience works differently in different circumstances means you can't say that there's not some characteristic or some trait that is real that we know we can work towards. But I think what it does in a particular context is simply a different question. And as I was saying before, if we go out and do a lot of studies about fortitude or the project you were working on and find that, well, this doesn't really look like the concept, then maybe it's time to revise what that concept is. And I think what's happened with concepts like resilience, they become a catch-all for a lot of things because, I don't know, we like to do that as human beings. And I think now I would say the same for other concepts like social capital. I think it's a really important concept that we can say something really meaningful about, but I think it gets used to mean a lot of different things. And no one ever talks about the downsides of it. You know, does it mean closure and taking resources from other people to benefit your in-group? You know, we come up with these concepts and then we just replicate them across a variety of contexts and lose the specific understanding of the concept. The context. I don't say we just throw out all concepts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, part of what I teach students when they're doing a research project is you have to, and I think this is, we as human beings, we engage with the world using concepts. There's nothing wrong with that. But the question is when and how do we deploy them? So in my particular research questions, I had a particular question in mind. And what I discovered in this project was not that I couldn't tell you what makes people resilient, I think I can. But I think I found that it's not the right concept to talk about every experience of trauma. Because sometimes people don't necessarily bounce back or become stronger, but yet we have a community obligation to still love people, which is what the young Pentecostal woman said when I said, well, why isn't everybody healed? And she said, well, ultimately, we have to love everybody, whether they change or not. And that's an important understanding. I mean, she wants people to be resilient. She thinks she can help people become resilient because she was, but that doesn't exhaust the motivation of what she's doing. She's doing what she's doing because she feels called to love people, regardless of whether or not they're resilient. Yes?
Thank you for the wide-ranging remarks, which give occasion to indeed leap in at different points and perhaps express some thoughts that may not seem terribly coherent, but I use that as sort of an open invitation. And unfortunately, coherence is sometimes confused with profundity, so I think it's the latter. But I think that I'm glad to stay on this because that's important, right? And I mean, if we can solve this, very much social science and philosophy have been unified, and theology, and we can go home. But talk about, of course, on the left you have rationality, probably fine, and essentially that reflects a rational choice understanding of social science. Now, what do we do about the stuff on the right? And so the big question is there a way that we can meaningfully engage that, say that we have a vocabulary as scholars, as social scientists, whatever. And I don't know that philosophy and theology are sufficient unto themselves. And if every sociologist has a philosophy, quoted from McIntyre, in a sense every philosopher perhaps has a sociology, some comprehension about how the world works. And so we have to somehow bring these two together. There you go. And rationality, in the right choice understanding, will simply take everything that's on that right side and say, yeah, thanks for coming back again. That's in the rational self-interest of that person. That's what they happen to like. And if they're incredibly generous, it just makes them feel good, so they're just saying to everybody else. To average people, there's something not quite satisfying about that. So I don't know if like materialism is a better understanding of the things on the left, some sort of pragmatic pursuit of material self-interest, that one can rationally be somewhat silly and crazy and faithful and everything else. But I think what they're trying to do is find a way to strike that balance, to bring a certain methodological sense, to appreciate this whole other hugely important part of life to real people. And, if you can do that, that'd be very nice, or, just see something else for us to do with it.
You've sort of hit on my whole large intellectual project, right? That on the one hand, I care deeply about the actual empirical cases I'm studying, and I care about practical solutions, and I do want to know what works. But I'm simply saying that doesn't exhaust all of reality, and it doesn't exhaust all of what it means to be a person. So in terms of bringing these two things together, I've straddled these two worlds for a number of years, right? And on the one hand, I've tried really hard to get sociologists to care about philosophy and theology, because I think it provides a really important set of concepts and traditions and wisdom. And most of the social sciences it's a child of the Enlightenment in the way we think about human persons. And so in that sense, I'm grateful to McIntyre for writing that book and for saying that maybe Enlightenment philosophy can't be the basis for the kind of sociology that I want to do, that cares about moral questions, which aren't ultimately empirical questions. I mean, I hope we can agree on that, but they're real and they matter. But at the same time, I hope that people who care deeply about moral and theological questions are willing to engage with social scientists who do immerse themselves in the world and conduct studies, and I think often produce really interesting findings. In one book published by a sociologist at Princeton, Evicted, his name is slipping my mind, but it's a really important book about the experience of homelessness. And I think even though he's not doing it explicitly from a philosophical or theological position, his immersion and his ethnographic work, I think, is outstanding. And I think it raises all kinds of important questions. So I do think some really good work is being done in the social sciences, and people in those fields, to go to my other slide, most people go into sociology and they actually really care about the normative and the practical. They care, but we're not training them in a way to make those transitions from the empirical to the normative and the practical, because it's not really in our toolkit. I did a project on how sociology teaches research methods, right? So I looked at research methods syllabi from probably 40 plus schools, R1 schools, liberal arts schools, and we focused so narrowly on these two things. Questions, and basically sociological research methods is data collection. When I teach research methods, I teach logics of inference from data, I teach research design, I teach kind of an old school way that was more common in sociology 50 years ago, right? Research design. And then from there, what kinds of inferences are you making? What is abductive logic? What is inductive logic, right? What's deductive logic? And I find that walking students through that and thinking about this process that we have to make when we make reasoned arguments from data back to theory, we're doing a kind of philosophy. And we shouldn't be ignorant of those terms or of the limitations of what kinds of logical deductions we can make from our data. And I have found, for better or for worse, given the rise of big data, people who collect big quantitative data are now also saying, oh my gosh, we have to go back and teach people logic. Because of this problem of confirmation bias. Almost any position you want to take, you can find data. If you can't find it, you can make it up, fabricate it, or just do a survey, there you go. So data's not enough, and the big data people are saying this. You have to have a framework to interpret that data. If you want to make it useful in any way other than an abstract generalization, you've got to have a framework for logics, for inference, etc. So why not think about how philosophers have talked about it? And I actually find some of the best books on this question come from critical realists. Berth Danermark is the book that I highly recommend, and that's what I teach to my students. And in a couple of weeks at least, I get them to be more thoughtful about the kinds of inferences that they're going to make from what they're studying in the world. I also love teaching the undergraduates, and this is my plug for kind of natural observation. Sending undergraduates out into the field with a really good guide for how to do ethnographic observations, they are so perceptive. They are so perceptive. I think maybe in part because they haven't figured out what their philosophical worldview is. But they're really good at observing social interactions in shopping malls and class differences on the bus and religious rituals and just what's going on. So I think even these young students who aren't trained in philosophy or theology, I mean, sometimes the insights they come up with just astound me. The kinds of interpretation that they can do about human behavior and social interactions, even without any kind of this formal training. And so then from that observation, I get them to sort of think, okay, well, what does that mean? And how do you think about that? And what are the implications of that?
Great. Thank you. Why don't we let Dennis's profound seeding question be the final question, and now we'll thank Dr. Mooney for your great presentation.
Thank you.